What if I told you that one of literature's most beloved characters was actually based on a horrifying occupational hazard that drove thousands of workers completely insane? The Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland isn't just a whimsical tea party host dancing around Wonderland. Behind that colorful top hat and eccentric riddles lies one of the darkest chapters in industrial history, where an entire profession slowly poisoned themselves to death while creating the fashion accessories that defined Victorian society. Today we're diving deep into the twisted reality that inspired Lewis Carroll's iconic character. And trust me, once you learn the truth about hat makers in the 18th and 19th centuries, you'll never look at the Mad Hatter the same way again. We're talking about mercury poisoning, neurological destruction, and an industry that literally drove its workers mad in the name of fashion. This isn't just literary analysis. This is a journey into how science, industry, and human suffering created one of fiction's most enduring figures. But before we unpack this dark tale, let me ask you something. How many times have you heard the phrase, mad as a hatter, without really thinking about where it came from? That expression didn't emerge from thin air or creative wordplay. It came from real observations of real people whose minds were systematically destroyed by their chosen profession. The rabbit hole we're about to go down makes Alice's adventure look like a pleasant afternoon stroll. The story begins in the workshops of 18th century Europe and America, where hat making wasn't just a craft. It was an art form that required incredible skill, precision, and unfortunately, exposure to one of the most dangerous substances known to humanity. Mercury, also known as quicksilver, was the secret ingredient that transformed rough animal fur into the smooth, luxurious felt that defined quality headwear. But mercury isn't just toxic, it's insidiously toxic, meaning it accumulates in your body over time, slowly rewiring your brain and nervous system in ways that were completely misunderstood for centuries. Picture this. You're a hat maker in 1800. You wake up every morning, walk into your workshop, and spend 8 to 12 hours breathing in mercury vapors while your hands work directly with mercury-treated materials. Day after day, month after month, year after year. The mercury doesn't just stay on your hands or in your lungs. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, one of the body's most protected boundaries, and begins systematically attacking your nervous system from the inside out. The symptoms started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Maybe you'd notice your hands trembling slightly when you tried to perform delicate work. Perhaps you'd find yourself becoming more irritable, more prone to sudden mood swings that seemed to come from nowhere. Your colleagues might comment that you seemed more forgetful, more prone to rambling conversations that jumped from topic to topic without apparent connection. But in an era before modern medicine understood neurological disorders, these changes were often dismissed as personality quirks or natural aging. As months turned into years, the symptoms intensified dramatically. The trembling in your hands would become so severe that holding tools became nearly impossible. Your speech would become slurred and difficult to understand. Your personality would undergo radical changes, swinging between extreme shyness and aggressive outbursts that alienated friends and family. You might develop what doctors called erethism, a condition characterized by pathological timidity, memory loss, and severe social anxiety that made normal human interaction almost impossible. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the hallucinations and delusions that marked the final stages of mercury poisoning. Hat makers would report seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices, and developing elaborate conspiracy theories about their co-workers, customers, or family members. They would engage in bizarre, repetitive behaviors, speaking in riddles or nonsensical phrases that made perfect sense to them, but sounded like complete madness to everyone else. Sound familiar? This is exactly the kind of behavior that Lewis Carroll immortalized in his Mad Hatter character. The process that created this nightmare was deceptively simple and had been used for centuries before anyone understood its devastating consequences. Hat makers would take raw animal fur, usually from rabbits, beavers, or other small mammals, and treat it with a mercury compound called mercurous nitrate. This chemical process, known as kerating because it often gave the fur an orange tint, made the individual hair fibers swell and develop microscopic barbs that would lock together when pressed and steamed, creating the dense, water-resistant felt that was so highly prized. Workers would spend hours each day in poorly ventilated workshops, stirring vats of mercury solutions, handling mercury-treated materials with their bare hands, and breathing air thick with mercury vapors. The workshops themselves became toxic environments where every surface was contaminated. Mercury would settle into the wooden workbenches, seep into the floor, and coat the walls. Even after a hat maker left work for the day, mercury residue on their clothes would continue exposing their families to this deadly poison. The tragedy is that many of these symptoms were actually well documented by the early 1800s, but the connection between mercury exposure and neurological damage wasn't fully understood or accepted by the medical community. Doctors of the era often attributed the hat maker's symptoms to moral failings, excessive drinking, or hereditary weakness. The phrase, "mad as a hatter," became common precisely because the connection between the profession and mental illness was so obvious to ordinary people, even when the scientific establishment couldn't explain it. What makes this story even more heartbreaking is that there were alternatives available. Some regions developed felt-making techniques that didn't require mercury, using heat, pressure, and other chemical treatments to achieve similar results. But these methods were often more time-consuming, more expensive, or produced felt that wasn't quite as fine as mercury-treated materials. In a competitive marketplace where quality and speed determined success, most hat makers continued using mercury despite growing awareness of its dangers. The human cost was staggering. Entire families were affected, as mercury poisoning wasn't limited to the workers themselves. Pregnant women whose husbands worked as hat makers often gave birth to children with developmental disabilities and neurological problems. Mercury contamination spread through communities, affecting everyone who lived near hat-making workshops or came into regular contact with the workers. By the mid-1800s, when Lewis Carroll was writing Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the figure of the Mad Hat Maker had become a well-established cultural archetype. Carroll didn't invent the Mad Hatter's eccentric behavior out of thin air. He was drawing on widespread social awareness of how mercury poisoning affected real people in a real profession. The characters' nonsensical riddles, sudden mood changes, and bizarre obsessions with time weren't just creative whimsy. They were realistic portrayals of mercury-induced neurological damage. But here's where the story gets even more fascinating. Carroll himself was a mathematician and logician who would have been familiar with the scientific discussions of his era about mercury poisoning. Some scholars believe that the Mad Hatter's famous riddle, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" was actually a subtle commentary on the arbitrary and illogical nature of industrial practices that prioritized profit over human health. The riddle has no logical answer because, like mercury poisoning and hat making, it represents a system that operates without rational justification. The Tea Party scene, which seems so charming and whimsical on the surface, becomes much darker when viewed through this lens. The Mad Hatter's obsession with time, his inability to move past 6 o'clock, could represent how mercury poisoning trapped workers in a kind of neurological purgatory where normal cognitive function became impossible. The endless circular conversations that go nowhere might reflect the repetitive, obsessive behaviors that characterized advanced mercury poisoning. Even the Hatter's appearance in the original illustrations takes on new meaning. The oversized hat, the wild hair, the staring eyes, these weren't just artistic choices to make the character look eccentric. They were visual representations of how mercury poisoning actually affected people's physical appearance. Advanced cases often developed distinctive facial tremors, unusual postures, and a wide-eyed stare that came from neurological damage affecting their facial muscles and eye movements. The most tragic aspect of this whole story is how long it took for meaningful change to occur. Despite mounting evidence of mercury's dangers, the hat-making industry continued using it well into the 20th century. It wasn't until the 1940s that mercury was finally banned from hat production in most countries. And even then, many manufacturers resisted the change because of concerns about quality and cost. By that time, thousands of workers had been affected. Some estimates suggest that in major hat-making centers like Danbury, Connecticut, which was known as the hat capital of the world, nearly 30% of hat workers showed signs of mercury poisoning by the early 1900s. These weren't isolated cases or rare occupational accidents. This was systematic poisoning of an entire workforce that continued for decades after the dangers were well documented. What's particularly disturbing is how the symptoms of mercury poisoning were often used to stigmatize and marginalize affected workers. Instead of being treated as victims of industrial negligence, hat makers who developed neurological symptoms were often dismissed as lazy, unreliable, or morally deficient. They lost their jobs, struggled to find new employment, and frequently ended up in poorhouses or asylums where their condition was attributed to personal failings rather than occupational hazards. This social dimension adds another layer to our understanding of the Mad Hatter character. In Victorian society, mental illness was heavily stigmatized, and people with neurological conditions were often treated as objects of ridicule or fear. Carroll's decision to make the Mad Hatter a sympathetic, even beloved character was actually quite radical for its time. By presenting the Hatter's madness as creative and entertaining rather than frightening or pitiable, Carroll was challenging social attitudes toward mental illness and occupational disabilities. The scientific understanding of mercury poisoning that emerged from studying hat makers actually contributed to broader advances in occupational health and neurology. Researchers studying affected workers helped establish the connection between environmental toxins and neurological disorders, laying groundwork for modern industrial safety regulations and our understanding of how heavy metals affect the nervous system. But the legacy of mercury in hat making extends beyond just historical curiosity or literary inspiration. It represents a pattern that we can still see in modern industries, where economic pressures override health concerns, where workers are exposed to dangerous substances because safer alternatives are more expensive or less convenient. The story of the Mad Hatter is ultimately a cautionary tale about how industrial progress can come at a devastating human cost when profit is prioritized over people. Today, when we watch the Mad Hatter host his eternal tea party in movies and television shows, we're watching a sanitized, commercialized version of what was originally a dark commentary on industrial exploitation. The real Mad Hatters weren't charming eccentrics hosting whimsical parties. They were working people whose minds and bodies were systematically destroyed by an industry that knew the dangers but chose to ignore them. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the literary value of Carroll's creation, but it does add profound depth to our appreciation of how great literature often emerges from social criticism and human suffering. The Mad Hatter endures as a character precisely because he represents something real and tragic that resonated with people who witnessed the actual effects of mercury poisoning in their communities. So the next time you encounter the Mad Hatter in any form of media, remember that behind the colorful costume and playful madness lies one of the darkest chapters in industrial history. Those riddles and nonsensical conversations aren't just creative wordplay. They're echoes of real human voices silenced by mercury poisoning. That's the true dark meaning behind the Mad Hatter's madness, and it's a story that deserves to be remembered alongside the fantasy that it inspired. The phrase "mad as a hatter" has outlived the industry that created it, but the lessons it teaches about industrial responsibility, worker protection, and the human cost of progress remain as relevant today as they were in Lewis Carroll's time.